Hey, folks. This mic feels a bit funky, so if I sound strange, somebody start waving their hands around, please. I apologize, I'm definitely the thing between you and cocktails. There are no more surprises after me, but I'll keep it pretty brief. And I'm very grateful that Creative Commons has the opportunity to even talk at a gathering like this, because I recognize that we're coming at questions around public goods and impact and value from maybe not quite as technical of a standpoint as this community, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration, so I appreciate it. In the event that people are not familiar with Creative Commons, I feel like maybe just I should give like a really rapid background. It was founded 21 years ago, and 20 years ago, this coming December, marks the release of the first set of the CC licenses. And so they came about during a time of rapid change on the internet. People remember that era, Y2K era. There were some interesting things happening at that time. There was what essentially the founders of the licenses saw as failed sharing. There was Napster, BitTorrents, the extension of copyright in the US had just taken place at the end of the 90s at the expense of the public domain. So suddenly the public domain was life of the author plus 70 years. So we actually had like a couple decade dry spell in the US of no new works entering the public domain. And then the lawyers that came together and founded Creative Commons, they also actually challenged that, challenged the constitutionality of that legislation all the way to the US Supreme Court, and unfortunately lost. But the Creative Commons license suite, it builds on copyright globally, and it gives anyone, authors, creators, it could be individuals, it could be groups, just the power to decide what you want to do with your work. So if you want to allow somebody else to reuse it or remix it, or even gain commercial benefits from it, there are 6 different licenses, and they go from being very, very permissive to the least permissive, but ultimately, it gives you the power that instead of reserving all your rights, you just reserve some of your rights and you give some of them away. At the end of the day, all of our licenses require one thing, which is crediting the creator. And this is something where I think there's a lot of interest in emerging technologies because of opportunities around provenance and tracking where things have been and where they were originally created and who contributed to what, which is, again, why I think it's relevant to think about the broader Creative Commons as a public good in sort of the context that we are talking about here. Today, Creative Commons is the global norm for how content is shared for reuse. It's used by governments, institutions, journals, musicians, artists all over. An important thing to note, it has nothing to do with ownership. So it's just copyright. It's not ownership of tangible works. And that's where I think there's also a ton of room for innovation. And so the thing that we went to ask ourselves is, how in this new world of emerging technology can we incentivize creators to share openly and sort of challenge some of these norms around copyright obsession, which I would venture to say is a little bit like a lottery ticket system these days. There's a whole emerging movement that have adopted public domain tools that Creative Commons created and stewards. CC0 might be one that you are familiar with. That is a public domain dedication. So if I take a photo of my adorable bulldog and I dedicate it to the public domain using that, anybody can use it for any purpose, anywhere. I don't have to wait to die and then another 70 years before that bulldog photo is usable by you all. So, and I think that's a public good right there. But since we're here talking about public goods, I just want to acknowledge that the definition of that varies greatly by context. So you could be talking about physical highways, you could be talking about information highways. Regardless of what it is, maintenance comes to mind as the important thing to consider. And so I'm grateful that there's both an online and offline focus in the discussions that have been going on here today. But for us, we were a product of the internet, and as such, we see our legal tools as a digital public good and sort of the part of the core infrastructure of the open web. And the broader Creative Commons, even though you can openly license something you wrote on the back of a napkin, typically this will apply to digital works. So I'm curious, before I keep rambling on here, I I think we're in a pretty sympathetic audience when thinking about public goods and how we want to support them and so on. And I'm curious if there are folks here who are currently supporting financially, whether through your $5 a month on PayPal or whatever it is, open infrastructure projects on the web. So if you'll humor me with a show of hands and say, and similarly, open knowledge projects, like any supporters here for Wikimedia or Internet Archive or, yes, lovely. So highly sympathetic audience to this. And you already understand how important public goods are to civic life and democracy and prosperity and so on. For CC, our biggest challenge is making the invisible visible, because there's this license layer that sits there that enables some of these things to happen. And so it's less of a thing. Like the picture of the bulldog is a really clear thing, but the license is just this infrastructure layer that ends up being hidden. And I would imagine in this room, y'all are supporting a whole host of other things beyond the digital, so good humans. But it makes me think about the people who are not sympathetic to this kind of work, right? When we're talking about value and impact and so on. So you probably know folks who don't necessarily appreciate it when they drive on a road that is not bumpy. Or in my neighborhood, it's not uncommon for somebody to roll up to pick up their kids from school, and they open the side door and just a styrofoam cup falls out and maybe some trash, and then the kid piles in and off they go. And that styrofoam cup, they're not caring about the environment, they're not caring about the community and cleanliness, they're maybe not even caring about the school where they're picking their kid up at. And these are conversations we need to bridge with people like this if we're going to bring people along in the public goods journey and the sort of shared, we all share in this wealth and in these commons. And I recognize that it would be naive to think we can bring everybody along, but we should really start thinking about the challenges we have in bridging this conversation with broader audiences. So for instance, measuring the impact of open content, so the broader Creative Commons, is incredibly difficult. There is a number of items out there. We estimate it to be about 2 billion at this point. That does not speak to the value of the broader Creative Commons. So when you say value, that's a value judgment in and of itself. But, are the photos from my family vacation equal in value to the broader public as, documentation of war crimes? I don't think so. I just don't. And these are all going to be personal value judgments that take place, but at the same time, me saying, oh, I think we estimate there's about 2 billion works that are openly licensed, that doesn't actually tell you what they have gone and done, what impact those have had on people's lives, how they may or may not have changed things. And it's hard to keep track of this as well in the Web 2 environment. And I use Web 2 and Web 3 terms sort of broadly and loosely, and trust that you sort of follow with what I'm up to there. There are some projects underway on Web 2 that pull these things together. Creative Commons actually launched one, was a search engine for openly licensed content, and has transitioned that over to WordPress. So if you are curious about it, it's called Openverse. And it's one area where you can go and see everything that's openly licensed. But again, we're very privacy focused. We don't know what somebody's going to do with that thing. Are they going to go and create a presentation for high schoolers? Are they going to write a book and put it on the cover? Tracking sort of the use and the subsequent value that's derived from this open content is very, very challenging. And we might ask ourselves, do we have to? If I've given something away, does it matter? Well, the creators in our broader community say, I am happy to give my work away. I'm happy for others to reuse it. But if there is financial benefit being gained from the work that I have carried out, yes, it would be nice to be rewarded, even if it's just a bit, if you think about it. And so, what we have now, in terms of speaking about the value of the broader Creative Commons and applying open licenses to your work, it's mostly anecdotal. So photographers have come up to us and said, hey, I shared my work openly, it spread across the web, people always saw my name on it, they contacted me to become their professional photographer. We talk to journalists who will publish their stories under an open license and say it expands the reach by over 50%, because then those are picked up for republication without any fear of licensing issues, amongst other nonprofit newsrooms typically. And there are more and more examples like that, museums that maybe digitize their collections, but nobody goes to their site, but people do go to the Wikimedia Commons, for instance, and there they have a 500-fold audience expansion because their work is more broadly available. So again, these all end up being typically pretty anecdotal or as a result of qualitative surveys, because just hard numbers on this front are very, very challenging. But I do think emerging technology is really interesting for this conundrum of measuring impact. And I think there's also a whole movement of creators adopting the public domain dedication that are relying on this. I'll put a little asterisk there and say, like, I'm not quite sure that just being able to point to provenance is always going to be the way to ensure that the original creator gets the credit that they deserve, because I think history has shown us that that is not always the case. So even if you can say, I was the first with this, somebody else maybe came along and did it better, and you gave it away. So there's a balance there, and there may be other tools or norms that we should develop that would be more useful for those communities. Right now, I'd say a lot of the attention is focused on NFTs. I mean, it makes sense. Like, there's a strong digital remix culture happening there. But like, beyond that, in terms of public goods, this is Open Access Week, actually. And there's, if you search that hashtag on Twitter or anywhere on the web, like, there's tons of talks going on in relation to open access. And that's an example of another broken business model, where if you want to publish in an open access journal, often you, the author or submitter, have to pay. And that's because these publications are going to get you coming or going. Either you're going to have to pay to read it, or you're going to have to pay to publish it. And often that discriminates even further against people in lower resourced institutions or from marginalized communities who maybe don't have access to the funds to be able to openly license and then share their research. But if it goes behind a paywall, then those same institutions may not have access to those journals. And so you get into this like self-perpetuating hellacious cycle of lack of access, when really we would all benefit from having more information. So there are a few models on Web 2 that record sort of the sum of all parts, and this is where I think it gets interesting to think about sort of provenance and value creation and sort of proportional rewards for folks. But like, imagine if you had a GitHub type system, but for content. So like, let's say you wrote a math textbook, and there it was, and then I came along and I added a chapter, and then somebody else came along and they took half of it and they translated it into another language. And all of this then ends up subsequently getting used one way or another. And ideally not everything is free in this glorious future world. And your efforts on the textbook and mine on the additional chapter and the translator's efforts, they all get rewarded or at least acknowledged in some way. Like, it's tracked that we did this, and if there is value to be had from this subsequently somehow, that is shared amongst us. So what this comes down, at least to me when I think about this, is less about licenses, and it's less about standards, and it's more about norms. So CC licenses for open knowledge, for creativity, like, it's the norm. If you're going to share your work, you're going to use the CC license. It's not actually even a formal technical standard per se, but we are very pro standards. Like, we don't want like massive splintering and all these different systems, and people are confused and they don't know how they can use things differently. I think it would be very messy if we had 30-odd, open content licenses out there. We're very lucky that we have sort of settled on a global standard, but more than anything, it's built this norm around this is how you share content. And so it allows you to end up without silos, and as long as you can ensure compatibility between these systems, or interoperability, then we should be fine. And we ask ourselves, like, how can we come together and shape a culture that cares about better sharing and open access and so on, and does it as a norm? Because I think that when it comes to technology, I think if we could code our way into getting good behavior from people, we'd probably already be there. I can tell you that the sticker charts that I have tried to use and failed repeatedly on my tiny humans tell me that game theory has its limits. And so it's more about, like, how do we just, like, engender this good behavior amongst all of us, recognizing that there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be the person that just doesn't care that the styrofoam is now in the sewage drain, which is very unfortunate. But I really think that, when we define public goods for ourselves, when we go beyond infrastructure or software or hardware or physical world, we need to just remember that, like, we have a large shared responsibility and a huge privilege to take care of these global commons. and we need to protect them as well. So we are not existing in an apolitical environment on this front, unfortunately, and there are persistent threats to access to knowledge every day, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. So very excited for technical innovations, and hoping that they can help us a lot, especially when it comes to discovery and decentralization, like the work that Filecoin is doing, and reimagining storage is excellent, and their focus on cultural heritage institutions, I think is critical. There are other Web3 protocols out there, like Arweave has integrated metadata related to licensing, so when you go to put something on the permaweb, you can indicate how it can or cannot be reused. And when we look back at our recorded history, our horizon in the future should be, we're not looking for like the technical solution. We're looking for like the next way to make this better, and the next way to make it more accessible and more equitable and more just in our sharing. But we're not gonna reach a final endpoint. I think hovercrafts will probably happen before we know it. So the challenges that we're facing right now to just get, I would say, from like our current walled gardens and broken business models on Web 2 from the perspective of the global commons, and helping people move into these emerging technologies are obviously usability. This is not news to anybody here, but making it user-friendly and accessible to people. We want to make sure that things are compatible. Like, I personally fear for another fragmented commons in Web 3. I think it would be wonderful if we could find a way that folks could agree on, like, this is how you're going to find things, these are how the systems are going to talk to each other. And I think there's excellent opportunity there. Also credibility, like, much like I say, like, how do we bring people along who don't currently care? Like, how do we get people to care who currently question whether this is actually the future? And that's something we can chat about over cocktails. So, keeping in mind that I promised to keep this brief, and I have not. I'm wondering about what to do next, and I'd say we need to talk more about these things. We also need to embrace flexibility, because when you're trying out new systems and so on, you need to be okay with them like failing a little bit, and maybe this one working a bit with the other, but maybe not so well, to figure out that this is actually where we want to land. I don't know, I was an Alta Vista baby. I loved Babelfish. But, here we have Google Translate today, and, it's probably okay that I'm not still on Babelfish, if that's how it's pronounced. But yes, I would just encourage us also to remember that tools and technology, it's just one part of this equation, and cultural and social norms are really the critical component for us to sort of bring this all together. So, let's figure out ways that we can fund these broader commons together, and the multiple definitions of the commons, because, to us, public interest values really matter. Currently, those are pretty overwhelmed by proprietary commercial interests, and we have users that take digital public infrastructure and, free and open knowledge for granted. And so, at the end of the day, we're still dealing with people. And so a community leading by example like yours, hosting important conversations like these, I think is the critical first step. So thank you very much. Let's have some cocktails. Unless you have questions. Talk about this stuff all day, clearly. But thank you very much. Yes, sir. Gosh, now I hope I have answers.
So there was just a presentation on hypercerts and
yes.
the way to retroactively fund contributions. And you were just talking about how to track contributions to a large knowledge commons.
It's so wild.
Right. So how do you see the hypercerts sort of retrospective funding model working to manage a more creative enterprise rather than a specifically impact-driven one?
So that's a really good question, and in the entire 45 minutes that I've had to digest hypercerts, I've got a very educated response. No, well, so what I thought was fascinating about that talk, too, was the acknowledgement, too, that sometimes you do just have to go with blind grants, like if you want to get something off the ground. And it got me thinking about, is there a way where you can have sort of like a minimum so a thing can function, so you trust that a thing can function, and then hypercerts can subsequently come when the thing that you have supported to function is creating greater value or a larger reward. So for instance, Here's Alice and Bob, and they're writing this math textbook together, and you're like, all right, I just need to give you, a basic income so you can work on this book for 3 months or whatever. But maybe subsequent to that, I was talking about this wonderful world where we all collaborate then on this textbook and then goes places and does good things and teaches a bunch of people math. That might be an example of where I would say retroactive value. You'd be like, oh, this actually went on and had a huge impact. It changed how people learned. Suddenly third graders are doing calculus. I don't know. It's all magic. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and truly it was fascinating listening to people go through these ideas, novel ideas today, and I am really excited for the cocktail hour because there's people I want to chat to. It's a good question.
Is there time for one more?
Sure.
Yeah. Since we're talking about content, I gotta ask, where do you feel that the field of content is going with quote-unquote AI-generated content and turning all these masses of public available data, a lot of it which is publicly available because it was published on CC licenses, and now it's all getting mashed up and generated into Frankenstein art and Frankenstein music. Where is it going, and how do you actually? And a lot of it can be claimed to be original as well, right? So, and a lot of it is now encoded in open source algorithms that can be run by anyone, and they will generate their new art that's based on that original stuff. And where does it go?
So this is a super challenging situation or space we find ourselves in. Creative Commons is actually hosting a couple of webinars on this in the beginning of November because it's such a challenging ecosystem. So we sort of think about it from an inputs and outputs perspective separately. So on the inputs front, to your point, a lot of people have used, or a lot of the creators of these data sets have said, oh, it's fine, it's CC licensed, so that's going to be a real safe way to use this. The actuality is there's a lot more than just openly licensed content being used to train these data sets, and depending on the region where it's happening, in the US, I believe it's under fair use, you can do so, text and data mining is permitted. But I think the flag has been raised on openly licensed content being used because someone is intentionally giving their work for a greater cause, and now suddenly it's being massively commercialized. And we're still the outputs of some of these systems, and I'm specifically thinking about the image ones right now, but I just saw an article about a new music one as well, is that it's potentially disruptive for the creator industry, which is also really challenging, obviously, for us as Creative Commons. And so we don't currently think that if I sit here and I go to one of these systems and I punch in, cute bulldog, that's not authorship. There's not human creativity. That's just a prompt. And so whatever that spits out, however scary that may look, that should be in the public domain. That's our current view on this. And I say current because like these technologies are evolving and the way people are handling inputs and outputs is evolving. I would definitely say come to our webinars as we dig more into these. But I think just like there is a challenge, there is also opportunity here. I don't know about the computing power that would go into this, but I have started to read early reports of systems where they're going to give value back to the creators that help train the model, for instance. So there might be like incentivization, like if you are a musician, to just go out there and put a whole bunch of riffs into this model and see what spits out, because suddenly you're a big contributor there. Not entirely related to this, but because of some of the copyright cases that have been brought on the music front specifically, there's a project out there called All the Music. I don't know if you've heard of it, but you're all like, yeah, tell us something we don't know. Anyway, it's fascinating. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. But it's a great way to show that like all creativity is really built on other creativity. Knowledge is built on knowledge, and so this like the sort of like measure of human authorship and like the individual pulling something together doesn't go down to like these 3 words in a sentence or these 3 chords together. Definitely didn't answer your question properly, but it's complicated. We can talk more over cocktails. Any other questions before y'all are free and clear on this beautiful Wednesday? Thank you very much.